you so much, Media Rumble, for having me here. And I'm delighted to be in conversation once again with Rasmus. Rasmus, as I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, is the director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. He's a professor of political communication at the University of Oxford and has served as the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Press Politics from 2015 to 2018. His work focuses on changes in the news media, political communication, and the role of digital technologies in both. I've had the good fortune of engaging with him on various conversations talking about the future and the challenges in news media in my capacity as being on the advisory board of the of RISJ. And without any further delay, I really think we should have Rasmus take over and walk us through some of the very insightful findings in the digital news report for 2020. Over to you, Rasmus.
Thank you, Ritu. So what I wanted to do today is just to pick a few highlights from the 2020 edition of our annual Reuters Institute Digital News Report. The Digital News Report is the world's biggest ongoing study of news and media use in the world. We cover 40 markets all across the globe on 6 continents. The study is a study of online news behavior, so it'll underrepresent those parts of the population who are offline. And it's made possible by a wide range of different sponsors, including media organizations like the BBC, different media regulators in Europe, foundations, universities, and a major brand from Google to a large technology company. Now, the study doesn't currently include India, but just the same way that I think that we can learn a lot about the future of journalism, news, and media in the rest of the world by looking at what happens in India. I also hope that journalists and editors and media executives and everyone who cares about the future of journalism and free expression in India feels that they can learn something from the things that we see in the rest of the world. And what we document in the Digital News Report really is an ongoing and global move towards a more digital, a more mobile, and a more platform-dominated media environment where print in particular, but also increasingly television is in structural decline, and increasingly are media that are primarily used by older people and niche media for most of the rest of the population. Whereas the majority of people, especially young people, in countries where they have affordable access, demonstrably prefer digital, mobile, and often also platform media. Now, when it comes to news specifically, we've seen, I think, much of this accelerated by the pandemic. Print circulation was restricted, advertising was hit hard, further reducing circulation. And many people found that digital was the most convenient and often most compelling way to access and navigate information about the ongoing crisis, where, of course, we hear various things from politicians, but not always, sadly, things that we can count on being reliable, true, or the complete picture, and of course also sometimes things that may, in part, be intended to distract us from big issues that some politicians seem uncomfortable acknowledging in public or even having others discuss in public. In terms of how this move towards a more digital, mobile, and platform-dominated environment works for news, I think the single most important thing to recognize is that while most people, of course, get online news in many different ways, we do find increasingly a move towards what we call distributed discovery. So when in the survey we ask people across these 40 markets to identify of the different ways in which they access news online, what's the most important way they do it? By now, it's only 28% who identify going directly to a news site or a news app as their main way of getting online news, whereas a clear majority rely on different forms of site door access, often via platforms like social media and search engines or aggregators, where the platform doesn't create the content, but controls the channel through which users access it. And this move is even more pronounced if we look just at the future of news and look at the respondents of what the Americans call Generation Z, so the respondents to the survey that are between 18 and 24. Here it's just 16% who say that going direct is their main way of getting news online, and 38% who identify social media, Facebook, Instagram, some of their smaller competitors, as their main way of getting news online. Now, as said, India is not covered in the digital news report at this stage, but we did do a pilot study specifically looking at the subset of the Indian population who are English speakers and have internet access. And that data from a small subset of the Indian market, I think, gives a sense of what this looks like in India. We did this study last year in 2019. And what we see there is a pattern very similar to what we see in the rest of the world. And again, an even more distributed environment with a heavy reliance on search and social, and just 18% last year in this sample, saying that going direct to a news site or a news app is their main way of getting online news. So while there is an increasingly intense and public and overdue and necessary discussion around the role of platform companies in our societies, in our media environment, including the many problems we've seen around disinformation and hate speech and problematic forms of advertising and data collection, we find no evidence in our research that usage is declining. When we look at the percentage of people who say they use different platforms just for any purpose in the past week, we've seen high and stable numbers for the most dominant platforms, Facebook and YouTube, for example, lower but still stable and often growing numbers for a platform like Twitter, and then big growth for a number of others, WhatsApp, Instagram, and from a lower base, something like Snapchat. So very, very high levels of use and often growing levels of use, in particular amongst younger people. If we turn then from sort of use in general to use for news in particular, we see sort of two things. One is that, first of all, the numbers are lower. News is part of what people access on platforms, but it's not all of it. And for many people, it's quite peripheral, even not really part of what they use these platforms for at all. So for Facebook and YouTube, it's somewhere in between a third and a quarter of users who say they get any news at all using this platform. And the numbers are much lower relative to user base for most of the other platforms. So high levels of use in general, fewer use it for news, but of course, because of their large user bases, these platforms are incredibly important for news consumption and distribution, as we see sometimes with ill effects across the world. Now, in addition to how people use news and access news, we also try to understand better people's perception of news in their societies, including the issue of whether they trust the news that they come across in different ways. Here, I think the numbers are quite challenging from the point of view of journalists and news media, in the sense that we find declines in trust year on year in many markets. Across the 40 markets we covered in 2020, comparing to those we covered in 2019, we've seen a further decline in trust in news. It's less than half of our respondents who say they trust even the news they themselves use, and far fewer who say they trust news overall. Now, here's something interesting, is that the numbers of people who say they trust the news they find via search or via social, even though, of course, much of that news often comes from publishers themselves, is much lower yet. So there is a clear trust gap between trust in news found via platforms and then trust in news that people access in other ways. Now, trust, of course, varies from country to country. In a few countries, it's still more than half the population who say that they trust most news most of the time. But we've seen big drops in many others, both in Europe and North America and in other parts of the world, very often around polarizing political events like the Hong Kong extradition bill protests or the very divisive election last year in the UK. Trust is also tied in with politics in many societies, though in interestingly different ways. That means we can't always jump to conclusions about who trusts the news and why. So I think it's often sort of well recognized around the world that if you look at the United States in particular, trust is much higher amongst people on the left, whereas people on the right, who may be supportive of President Donald Trump, have much, much lower levels of trust in the news. So very strong partisan polarization, a huge gap between people on the right and people on the left in terms of their trust in news in the United States. But interestingly, in the United Kingdom, actually, the pattern is the opposite. The polarization is much less pronounced, but in the UK, it's long been the case it's people on the right who tend to trust the news more and people on the left who trust it less. Perhaps a reflection of a situation in the UK where many of the national newspapers are seen by many as being right-leaning or even outright right-wing, leading to many people to sort of be questioning of this if they themselves hold other political beliefs. So the connection between politics and trust in news plays out in quite different ways in different countries. And indeed, in India in 2019, when we did the study there, we found that people who didn't identify with any of the political parties and were quite alienated from the political process often had far lower levels of trust in news than people who identified with a political party, whether that was BJP or one of the parties in the UPA, like Congress or others. Now, of course, not everything is about politics. And this year we try to understand better whether people are more drawn to more partisan news sites that we see in many countries around the world. Interestingly, we find in every country what we call a silent majority for impartial news, where people say that they prefer to get news from sources that express no particular point of view. Large majorities in most countries, in the UK, for example, more than 3/4. And even in a country like the United States, it's very polarized and has very prominent sort of fully throated partisan sites like Fox News, for example. It's just 30% who say they prefer to get news from sites that share their point of view. And even there is a majority for news that express no particular point of view. Now, trust, of course, is tied in with concerns over misinformation. One thing we found again and again in this study over the years is that many people understandably and often quite rightly are worried about whether the information and sometimes the news that they come across online is real or fake. This year, what we wanted to do is to better understand what are the sources of misinformation and the platforms for misinformation that people are most concerned about in different parts of the world. And here I think the findings are really quite striking. So when we look at sources of misinformation first, there is a very clear pattern in almost every country we look at. People say that the single thing that they're most concerned about is false or misleading information from domestic politicians, from their own elected officials, who may sort of make false or misleading claims about the situation or try to repress conversations. And there are concerns about other potential sources of false and misleading information. Activists, sadly, many people, in some countries perhaps rightly, are worried about the behavior of at least some journalists. Some are worried about the sort of proverbial stranger on the internet making things up and spreading misleading information. And of course, some are concerned about the behavior of foreign governments, the information operations that have been revealed around the world that have infiltrated different platforms like Facebook and others and have demonstrably tried to meddle in domestic politics in other countries. But really the center point of concern for a large number of people around the world is the behavior of their own politicians and whether they are trying to spread false and misleading information. If we turn then from the question of the sources of misinformation to the question of the platforms for misinformation, again, there is quite a clear pattern here. Facebook is the platform that most people say that they are concerned about as a platform where they might come across false and misleading information. High levels of concern also about messaging applications, of course, many of them in turn owned by Facebook, like WhatsApp. Some concern about search, often effectively this means Google. And then quite interestingly, I think, quite low levels of concern over YouTube. The fact that there is less concern over Twitter, I think, in large part reflect the fact that Twitter has many fewer users than the largest and most dominant platform companies. Now here, the concerns are a bit different from country to country. In most markets, Facebook is named as the platform that most people say they're most concerned about as a platform for potentially false and misleading information. But there are markets, often in Latin America and also some in Asia Pacific, where WhatsApp is named as the platform that most people say they're most concerned about. And then a few where it's the Google-owned YouTube in South Korea, and in the case of Japan, it's actually Twitter that we have a lot of people saying they're most concerned about, more than say they're concerned about any other platform. Now, what can we do about all this misinformation? I mean, of course, this is an incredibly sort of complicated issue to deal with, as journalists and have dealt with powerful people in life for a long time know well from experience. But what we try to do in the study this year is to get an understanding of what this looks like from the point of view of the public. What do ordinary citizens think that editors, for example, and journalists on the one hand, and on the other hand, platform companies should do about different kinds of potentially false and misleading information? So we asked one question, which was about news media. And the question was, if a politician makes a statement that could be false, which comes closer to your view about what the news media should do? And here we have a clear majority, 52%, say that the news media should report the statement prominently, even if it could be false, because it's important for the public to know what the politician said. So I think a quite strong support for the conventional editorial line that the news media may report things that could be false or are demonstrably false if powerful people say them, because it's newsworthy and the public has the right to know with proper editing and context. If their elected officials or others are lying to the public or in other ways trying to mislead the electorate. Now, if we turn then from the question of editorial coverage of potentially false statements from politicians to the question of whether politicians themselves should be allowed to buy ads that could be inaccurate and mislead the public, here the opinions are very different. So the question we ask the public there is, thinking about the responsibility of technology companies like Facebook, Google, or Twitter, if a politician or a political party takes out an advertisement that could be inaccurate, what comes closer to your own view about what the tech company should do? And here again, we see a majority, 58%, say that they feel the companies in that case should block the advertisement because the technology company should be responsible for making sure that information on their platform is true. So very interestingly, sort of quite a strong mandate for journalists to cover things that could be false, but also widespread public demand for the technology companies to more actively moderate at least bold political communication where politicians might try to mislead the public through ads. So just a quick recap before we turn over to the discussion and the Q&A session. So we've seen the coronavirus crisis has really accelerated the ongoing and already sort of long happening move to a more digital, more mobile, and more platform-dominated media environment. In this environment, as advertising increasingly goes to platforms, people's willingness to pay for news become more important if we think about the sustainability of the business of news. We also see that trust in news continues to fall in many countries, with partisanship often a key factor. And there is a real question, I think, here for journalists and editors, but also for others who care about credible information about how we might be able to rebuild trust, especially in polarized societies. Trust, of course, then is tied in with issues of misinformation. And here I think it is really important to recognize that a very large number of people really blame politicians for many of these problems of misinformation. They're concerned about elected officials and other powerful people who lie and try to mislead the public. There is also concern about some of the platforms, but it's a heavy focus really on politicians as a large source of problems of misinformation. And finally, majorities say that they believe the news media should report even when politician statements might be false, but they're very critical of the platform companies' willingness to run political ads even when they could be inaccurate. So with that, I will stop sharing these slides and turn back to the conversation. And I look forward, of course, first of all, to the discussion with Ritu, and then later on to the questions from those who've joined the call.
Thanks so much, Rasmus. I just find that in the last several months, every time I hear you discuss the findings from the report, I find that the context for me has changed, and the same findings seem to have take on slightly differing meanings more and more. Before we get into the discussion, just another housekeeping reminder. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask Rasmus, please remember to put them out in the Q&A section and don't share them in the chat section, please. Rasmus, just straight off, this exodus to digital, as you know, with COVID-19 and the pandemic and everything that happened to print and to some extent broadcast, especially in the context of ad revenue, this exodus to digital, as though it was the land of salvation, just an understanding of who do you think and what do you think will it take to win that space? Because now it's going to be a very, very crowded space. This was a space that people like us or like Newslaundry, we were innovating and experimenting and being fairly agile in the new media as it's defined space. But now it's going to be a crowded space, and so who needs to do what? There is the agile media, which has the innovative mindset, but will not have as low on cost structures, but does not have the capital that is perhaps needed to make the leap, especially the tech leap, which is clearly what is needed? Or is it the legacy with the brand loyalty and the deep enough pockets, but with huge cost structures? So, where do you think we are at now?
Sure. I mean, I think this is a decisive issue in many ways. I mean, I suppose in my personal opinion, in most parts of the world, economic sustainability is a precondition of editorial independence. Otherwise, journalists and newsrooms become dependent on proprietors or on various sort of political patrons who will keep the ship afloat in ways that will often compromise independence. So I think economic sustainability is something that journalists often don't think much about, but I think is actually quite central to their ability to pursue the mission of seeking truth and reporting it. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I think it's going to be very tough to make digital work from a business point of view. And we need to recognize that from the point of view of many others who are not publishers and not journalists, the move to digital is driven by the fact that people think it's superior. From my point of view as a citizen, digital is vastly superior to relying on print and broadcast. It's easier, it's more convenient, it gives me a bigger choice, it's often cheaper. From the point of view of advertisers, it's also superior. It's cheaper, you can get more targeting, you can get more scale often. And while there are many problems with digital advertising around accountability and various forms of fraud, let's not forget that there were issues like that in other forms of advertising as well. So from the point of view of advertisers, it's quite rational. That's where they're investing their time and money. Now, if we think then about news media specifically, who might succeed in this space, I mean, the way I often think about it is I think the challenge for a lot of sort of established news media, sadly, is often how can you get small enough, quick enough if you're very big, because the cost structures that were built in the past are not going to be sustainable in a more purely digital environment. And they come into that change with some great assets. I mean, there are very few things that beat the advantages of having a strong brand, but they also, of course, come with liabilities, which is very hard to change an organization. It's been very good at doing something for a long time, and now need to do something else entirely. For startups and new entrants, often the challenge is how can you get big enough quickly enough to be sustainable? How can you reach critical mass while still retaining a really lean cost structure? And I think when we think about the different sort of types of media that might succeed in this space, I think we are beginning to see some examples of sort of proof of concept. In a lot of countries, we see sort of a winner takes most dynamic, where a few upmarket brands with very distinct, valuable, added value, quality journalism are doing well in terms of recruiting subscribers. Of course, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal in the United States. We also see, I think, at the same time that some new entrants are doing the same. El Diario in Spain, Mediapart in France, The Correspondent in the Netherlands. So this is not only Malaysia Kini in Malaysia, not only legacy ones. So that's one, the sort of winner takes most around subscription for distinct, valuable journalism. Then scale is going to be very, very tough, because I don't think we sort of fully understand what scale means in a world where Facebook has, 2.5 billion users. Scale needs to be very, very big before it really counts for something in the ad market. And the revenue it'll generate will be much less than in a less competitive pre-digital environment. So even very, very large audiences can be quite hard to monetize in a way that really generates enough revenue to sustain a large newsroom. But we are seeing some who say they're succeeding in this space. In France, for example, a site called Brut, which is primarily about social distribution and video journalism, is very, very lean and say they're profitable on the basis of social distribution most. So there are some who believe that this is going to work for them. I think it will. The advertising will continue to be important, and free at the point of consumption and ads go hand in hand often for scale businesses. But it is a tough market, and it'll probably be winner takes most, with a few large companies or large groups doing better than most others. Then we have sort of very specialized niche publications that start small and stay small and really own a particular issue. Often this will be quite heavily focused on subscription, and then various forms of offline revenues like events and other things that are quite difficult during a pandemic, but are often important ways in which they make sure they generate the revenue to sustain their very, very specialized, in-depth journalism on just one topic and one issue. And I think we are seeing also examples of this succeed in different places. Those are three commercial models. I think we also need to recognize that with this move to digital, we are also going to see a very large-scale influx of politics in the media. Again, politics, of course, never went away. But as news media become less profitable and less lucrative, it also becomes cheaper for people who want to acquire or own and operate news media essentially for political purposes to do so. And we are seeing this across many parts of the world, that not only do we have the long-standing issues of oligarchs who control news media effectively to either protect or advance their other business interests or their ideological convictions, but also that increasingly different sort of politically affiliated groups are creating news media essentially not to make money and do independent journalism, but to influence public discourse. And this will be cheaper in a digital environment, and they will compete with news media that will be weakened by the switch to digital. So I think it's a really challenging environment. I will say that while it is challenging, we need to remember that from the point of view of the public, the reason we're moving in this direction is that from their point of view, this is often better. They like it better. It's not that they can't buy print newspapers, it's that they don't, because they find other things they like more. And I think we have to accept that and then find out how we do really good journalism in that space on the media that people prefer, whether that is paid for or ad-supported or niche journalism, so that we can continue to pursue our work also in the future. And I'm very inspired by the examples we see of people around the world, not just in rich countries, also in Malaysia, and for that matter, the Daily Maverick in South Africa, who are making that work. And I am sure that versions of that will work in India as well.
I think in India, one of the challenges that we really have is that there are actually very few people who own, very few large corporates with political affiliations that own almost all of media. Just that the ownership structures in India can be complicated enough to be opaque, and you don't know who really owns what, and therefore substantial, significant entries into digital are also going to be a challenge. And I think the survival game is a critical time period for that is the summer of 2020 to the summer of 2021, because that's the time people are coming into the digital space, but they're all vying for the same slices of the ad pie, which is obviously much more demanding. So two questions. Do you see advertisers opting more for the programmatic display safe space, or is the branded content innovations in advertising going to come into play? That's one question. The other question is that if you're trying to then look away from the ad revenue or not be as dependent as we have been on it, and you're looking at subscription as the future, and differentiated content is critical, or quality, credibility is critical to finding subscriber, there is again the conflict of, what is now called the tyranny of technology, where there is a volume of audiences which is important, which is coming through, trending keywords, where unfortunate things are determining what news is being created. And on the other hand, the emphasis on the value per subscriber. In a lot of conversations, I find that a lot of news media is now trying to grapple between which bucket they want to be on. Can they let go of that finely sliced ad pie and focus only on value per subscriber and focus more on engagement and credibility and differentiation, or try and straddle both boats, because this is a time of uncertainty and you don't know which way it's going to go?
Yeah. It's always easier to sort of say these things than it is to do them. And I have profound respect for executives and owners who are trying to steer their news organizations through a really, really challenging environment. This stuff is hard. You know that well from your experience, and your competitors and peers do so as well. So I'm not a backseat driver. I'm not telling people that the answers are obvious here. I don't think they are. I think from a sort of an analytical point of view, I think the challenge essentially is that we've been used to having sort of a single product that generated sort of two very different kinds of revenue. One was consumer revenue, the other one was advertising revenue, but there was a single product, the newspaper, that integrated ads and content that delivered all of it. Now in India, this was primarily ad revenue, and the copy price was more a sort of way of easing distribution and really an important part of the income stream. But in much of the rest of the world, it was often sort of half-half, more or less, or maybe 1/3 consumer revenue and 2/3 ad revenue. Now, if you'll excuse a UK example, I think the challenge is that I'm not sure we've always understood how different the two extremes now are of consumer revenue or ad revenue. So in the UK, a print newspaper historically for the publisher generated £1 revenue, of which about 1/3 was consumer revenue and about 2/3 was ads. One copy, £1. In an online environment, one page view generates about 1 penny. So 1/100th of what a print copy generated. At one end, the very, very lean end, so you need a huge amount of pennies to generate the revenues. A huge, absolutely staggering amount of page views to generate the same kind of revenues you did from your print product. At the other extreme of subscription, the Times of London charges £15 a month. So a single subscriber is worth so much more than many, many page views. And it's a completely different kind of relationship to have with the user. And I think with a few exceptions of sort of large established brands who may find some form of freemium or metered paywall model works to deliver both some of the scale that brings in lots of pennies and some of the deep relationship that convinces a significant number of people to pay, I think for most other news organizations, they probably have to make a choice. Are we one or the other? Are we either lots of pennies, and that requires one sort of scale-oriented strategy, or are we a much more limited number of pounds that then require a completely different relationship with people? Now, there are other ways of trying to do this with generating the revenues in other ways, events and services and things like that. But fundamentally, I think more and more news media will have to make a choice to think about, are we scale in pennies or are we subscription in pounds? And be really, really realistic. They really are pennies. And at the other end, they are pounds. There'll be fewer of the subscribers, but there are pounds if you can convince people to pay. And this is a completely different approach from what we have seen for a long time, where scale really was the name of the game for almost every time.
Moving on to the point, your report's findings on trust and misinformation. While it shows, your Jan poll shows clearly that only 4 out of 10 people trust the news media at all. And there's also the understanding that social platforms are not to be trusted. And yet the study shows that the consumption of content and it getting conflated as consumption of news content on social media is actually growing. And platforms like Instagram and WhatsApp, we're seeing a clear uptick. Twitter and Facebook, of course, continue to be strong players. So what is this? What is this? Is this audience? Is the digital audience fickle? Is it hypocritical? I was just reading up on this study that was done by a Knight Fellow in India, Ritu Parekh, and he used cognitive psychology to understand why in India are people turning to WhatsApp for news. Why are they not coming to sites? As we know in India, it's definitely even, the last finding was 18% coming to news sites. And his findings really listed out 5 things. There was relevance, ease of comprehension or ease of storytelling. There was the bias, which obviously leans towards the filter bubble or the confirmation bias clearly. And very interestingly, trust or influence, or trust became an important thing. So people are preferring to consume news content in India, at least, which comes sort of underlined and very validated by people they trust in quiet news groups on WhatsApp. And so now how does, and WhatsApp is the dark web. Now, how do you battle that? How do you we're so many of us in the process of fact checking, but that's, how do you combat that? I don't know if you have a light at the end of the tunnel here.
I mean, I think this is a major challenge, and the study you mentioned sounds fascinating, and I'll look forward to reading that on the specificities of the Indian situation, which I think is so illustrative and indicative, and something the rest of us can really learn from, because the issues that have emerged in India early on, I think, are issues that are becoming increasingly important in many other parts of the world. So I look forward to reading that study. I would say several things. I think broadly our research suggests some similar findings. I think, first of all, we should recognize that people often come across news on different platforms, whether messaging applications or social sites, while they use them for something else. And news is not very central to their use of these platforms. Messaging applications are used for everyday coordination, for staying in touch with people you care about, for solving everyday problems and transmitting information and navigating your sort of day-to-day life. Social media is sort of performative. It gives a sort of an ambient sense of what friends are up to and what's happening in the world. And often news is not particularly central to any of those activities. But of course, because so many people use these platforms and use them for so many different things, they also use them to share news that they care about and that they believe matters for people they care about. So I think news is often quite incidental in these environments, but because people spend so much time there and do so many different things with the platforms, they also come across news there. That's why I'm quite encouraged actually by the low trust, because I think it reflects a situation where people are perfectly capable of using something for many different purposes, while also being quite skeptical as to whether that platform and the information that come across there is actually sort of trustworthy and credible when it comes to public affairs and current affairs. So you can use something and see something without liking it. I mean, for a long time in the UK, the tabloid newspapers were by far the most widely read, but are also by far the least trusted. So we have seen versions of this before. Now, in terms of how journalists and news media can respond to this, I mean, I think some of these things are not under our control. I mean, people consume news in a society where there are political disputes and political attacks on the news. They consume news in societies where different groups, have very different views of the world, and news will often be sort of read through the lens of these different experiences. And of course, increasingly they consume them via these platforms that also are largely beyond the control of journalists and editors. But I think there are some things that we can control, which is the extent to which the journalism that we do respects and reflects the experience of the public and the particular public that one given publication wants to serve, but also the public at large. And I think we have to be honest, I think we have a lot to answer for in that space, in the space of journalism and news publishing when we look back, of which, in the West, there are huge issues around racism and a very sort of a wide gaze in journalism, both internationally and domestically. There is a very, very profound and long history of sexism and misogyny with a very sort of male approach to the news. And there are many, many issues around class as well, and in India, of course, around caste. I mean, I think the point about Brahminical journalism is well made, that one can simultaneously recognize that there is some very, very impressive quality journalism being done in India, even as it may also sometimes unconsciously and perhaps sadly in a few cases consciously be very disrespectful of the experience and perspective of large parts of the population. So I think if we want to claim that we are for the public, I think we have to sort of show that we are for all the public. For young women living in urban areas, not just their fathers and brothers, for different castes, different class backgrounds, and for different colors and creeds as well. And if we aren't, then we shouldn't be surprised if people don't trust us.
Of course, in India, the gender battle on access to news is another one, because just the access to connectivity or access to devices is a huge.
Absolutely. I mean, if there are
huge
patriarchal structures that leads your family members to take your phone away, I mean, that's a whole other barrier, of course.
Right. On the opinion versus fact, now the study clearly shows that people would rather have fact only, even if it is the straight fact being a politician's speech. People would rather news media just gave them fact and did not give opinion. And, I'd like to quote, Nick Newman quotes, it's a quote from him in the study, and he says, divided societies trust news media less, not because the journalism is worse, but because people are generally dissatisfied with institutions in their country, and because outlets often carry more views that people disagree with. Now, I was just wondering that if you were to map this finding with the actual analytics on what actually is getting consumed on news sites, I don't know whether that will match. I don't know whether people are coming in and only consuming fact on news sites. It's possible that they prefer fact and the opinion they prefer in their WhatsApp groups. But I think, and I may be speaking more for India, I don't think people are just happy with just consuming fact without views. There's this polarization. You will just go to the news site where you agree more with the views than the other one.
No, I mean, I think that's a fair objection and criticism, and a closer look at the analytics, internal data from news companies may well challenge the public opinion. And it wouldn't be the first time that people say one thing and do something else. I will probably say in a opinion poll that I think physical exercise is very important, but if you track my daily behavior, you may find that I get rather less of it than I perhaps should. I mean, I would say that I think there are sort of two things that to sort of observe on this. One is that a challenge in research like this often is that, you know, your views might be my facts and my facts might be your views. And it's hard sometimes to really get a firmer understanding of whether when people say that they prefer news that express no particular point of view, that whether what they mean is really that they prefer news that express their point of view. They just don't see their own point of view as a point of view. They see it as a fact, if you will. I think there is sometimes a bit of a naturalization, and we shouldn't also confuse, you know, moderate centrism and he said, she said approaches to the status quo is not the same as sort of impartiality or neutrality necessarily. I mean, these are sort of not the same thing, even if they feel like the same thing or look like the same thing for much of the public. That said, I would add that at least in the UK, we did quite a close study of news consumption around the coronavirus crisis for 4 months and tracked, amongst other things, the most read news articles on the 3 most widely news sites in the UK, the BBC, the Mail Online, and the Guardian. Now, the BBC, of course, is one thing, but if you look at the Mail, which is widely regarded as a right-wing newspaper, and the Guardian, widely regarded as a left-wing newspaper, both of them well known for having many prominent and interesting opinion columnists of very different persuasions. It is exceedingly rare that any of the opinion pieces made the top 10, the list of the most read articles of either of those through 4 months of the pandemic, not because there weren't any opinion pieces, there were plenty of them. Many pundits have remarkably interesting and often ill-informed views on what everyone else should do in a pandemic. It was the news coverage. It was overwhelmingly straight news coverage that was the most widely read stories from those sites, at least.
I think we need to move quickly to the Q&A. Just that, the point that I'd like to sort of wedge in quickly is, I think, would you think surveys done at a time of fear and uncertainty, like there is now, this is an unprecedented fear, foreboding, uncertainty, economic distress. Studies are showing, for instance, that in India, people have much more faith in announcements and speeches by the Prime Minister today than they would have otherwise. And in an environment like that, does social platforms blocking of political ads, which are at least clearly, transparently advertising by political parties, effective enough, or is the real danger lying in proxy pages or handles, which are far more duplicitous in what they're doing? Unfortunately, we don't have time to get into that debate, but just a quick word from you on that, and then we'll open up to Q&A.
I mean, I think that the second problem you describe is very clearly increasingly problematic online, and that it exists on the open web, but it's very heavily intertwined with the platform companies through which people often access and find this information. And I think, it's not like my heart goes out to them. These are rich and powerful companies, and they should sort of take responsibility for the role they play in our societies. But I think we should recognize it's not easy for a for-profit company to decide, what constitutes reliable and trustworthy information and what doesn't for everybody at scale instantaneously. And it's also not easy for them to impose greater transparency on powerful political actors if these powerful political actors themselves are very hostile to transparency. If organized and powerful political interests want to be able to mislead the public by any means necessary, whether that's sharing through messaging applications or duplicitous pages online and whatnot with plausible deniability all the time, it wasn't us. Who it was, question mark. It's hard to see realistically why we should expect large for-profit companies to unilaterally go in and force politicians in some countries, the government and the governing party, to be transparent and exposed in a way that they don't. These are the people who regulate the companies. I might wish it as a citizen, but I can understand from a sort of a realistic point of view why this is a difficult decision to make for companies that ultimately are responsible to their shareholders and often will be pragmatic in ways that have questionable consequences for public discourse.
Thanks, Rasmus. I'm going to quickly move to the Q&A. The first one picking is from an anonymous attendee, And he says, when you say people are concerned about politicians spreading misinformation, what exactly do they say? Could you elaborate a bit?
The survey is a survey in each of the 40 markets covered of a sample that represents the part of the population that has access to the internet. We asked them with the examples that I gave in a situation, we give them a list of sources that could be sources of false or misleading information, and then we ask them which one of these, if any, are you most concerned about, and then they click one of them. That's the way the survey works. And I appreciate the subtext of the question, which is that this stuff is very complicated, and I agree it is very complicated. We've done other forms of research where we try to gather this through focus groups and interviews, but sadly for an international study of 40 markets, we're not able to get that nuance in. So what we wanted to get here is just sort of a top line understanding of what are people most concerned about when it comes to misinformation. And the answers, I have to say, are aligned with what we have found in our qualitative research in the markets where we've done it. The most common examples when we ask people in focus groups, for example, to define what they mean by fake news is hyper-partisan discourse by pundits and politicians and others who exaggerate and sort of select facts to fit their views to a degree where people feel that this is effectively misinformation.
I'm going to jump to the next question from Gaurav Manan. He wants to know what your thoughts are on deepfake videos that are widely being circulated and used as political tools. Is there a way to tackle them?
Thanks. I mean, I think there's been a lot of discussion of deepfakes recently, and we have seen, I think, now the first political examples. In the future, this may become a bigger problem. So far, as almost no examples of deepfakes actually being used for misinformation purposes. And while they may be used in the future, I think we should recognize that the problems we have right now are overwhelmingly about what Joan Donovan from Harvard calls cheap fakes, which is sort of very simple manipulation using off-the-shelf basic tools, or simple misrepresentation, where things are taken out of context and purports to convey information that they really don't, or just flat out lies. I think sometimes there is a tendency in these discussions, I'm not saying this is what is suggested by the questions, but more broadly, I think there is a tendency to sort of focus on exotic problems, if you will, deep fakes or very convoluted information operations, and other forms of sort of quite technically sophisticated or laborious forms of misinformation. These are real things, but the bulk of misinformation we see is very simple. It's powerful people who lie. It's people who support them, who edit things to fit that view, and who try to foist it upon other people, some of whom may actually sadly believe that it's true.
Question from Nihit Sachdeva, and this is, I think, in the context of the way we've been reporting on the death of a big star in India. His question is, what is your opinion on any news website calling out some news channel for the way they do journalism, in quotes, regardless of the fact whether the channel is right or wrong? Is it ethical? Is it ethical essentially for one news media house to call out the quality of journalism of another?
I mean, I don't know the particular case, so I'm not going to sort of offer a view on something about which I know nothing. I would say more broadly, I think that in journalism in many countries, there has long been a sort of unspoken norm that journalists and news media abstain from commenting on one another's practices, as sort of what I think an unkind outsider might call honor amongst thieves. I think this is increasingly problematic. Much of the public is patently not trusting much of the news that they see. And in the absence of a public and explicit discussion about what journalists consider to be the difference between good journalism and bad journalism, credible journalism and incredible journalism, in the absence of an explicit public discussion of that, I think much of the public will jump to the erroneous conclusion that the worst example of what they see is representative of all journalism. If we aren't willing to help people understand the difference between what we think is credible and what isn't, between what we think is good and what isn't, why should we expect them to make those distinctions in a way that reflect our interpretations or our professional standards? I mean, I think we need a much more explicit and public discourse about journalism, not to sort of, stab each other in the back, but to have a sort of a free and frank exchange of views about our own practices, the way that journalists have felt completely comfortable doing about politicians and all sorts of other powerful institutions and societies. It's the classic question: who guards the guardians? And in journalism and news media, sadly, often the answer has been no one guards the guardians, though, of course, I'm glad in India that Newslaundry and a few other sites do keep an eye on what is actually happening in journalism and the news business in India.
I'm hoping we have time for another question, if not another couple of questions. Another anonymous attendee, when we saw how Donald Trump issued an executive order which threatened to take away legal protections given to social media platforms. This was in response to Twitter fact-checking his tweets. Do you think it's time that the utterances of politicians and public office holders be scrutinized more closely than regular tweets?
I think we are moving in a quite a challenging and problematic direction in many different parts of the world. The US is the most prominent of it, where you have sort of, I think, two things happening at the same time. You have, on the one hand, you have large and powerful platform companies that are effectively importing norms of parliamentary privilege and the exemption of political advertising from standards of accuracy that are often upheld in commercial advertising, at least in part, or at least with some attempts at enforcement, are effectively exempting them from those regulations, arguing it isn't up to them to make these calls. Now, I think it's probably right, in my personal point of view, it isn't up to them to make these calls, but when it's combined with a regulatory vacuum, where the politicians who are involved in these problematic practices have come to the decision, I'm sure, from a purely impartial point of view, that they should not be regulated and should be allowed to do whatever they please online. I think we have quite a dangerous situation. I think we have a regulatory vacuum, and in that regulatory vacuum, the platform companies have to make decisions, many of which I think are imperfect at best, and none of whom have any kind of real political legitimacy because they aren't based on elected officials making collectively binding clear rules. In almost every country I know of, they have simply failed to do so, at best through, if you will, circumstances, and at worst because they don't want to be regulated. The second thing I think we're seeing happening, and I know there's been considerable controversy in India recently about this phenomenon too, is that a number of powerful politicians are, of course, completely unafraid to heavily try to lobby and influence what they see as the gatekeepers of public discourse to try to favor them in one or more ways. This has always been the case with news media. Politicians have always tried to influence the news media to favor them in elections, to influence them, to control them, to bully them. We see this all over the world today as well. They are increasingly trying to use, some politicians are increasingly trying to use the same mechanisms to try to bully and influence and co-opt the platform companies to advance their political agenda. And I think this leaves a very real risk that they will respond to that, as some news media sadly have, to such bullying in ways that may help a few politicians but are detrimental to public discourse and to a free and informed public debate and to free and fair elections, frankly.
Thanks so much, Rasmus. This has always been an exciting conversation with you. I'd really be excited to see, if you were to do a survey today in India, whether it would be the right-leaning or the left-leaning that would show up to have higher trust in news media today. Thank you so much for the report and for all the discourse around the report.